Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. I'm your host, Leighton Gray, also known sometimes as the spiritual gangster, as the sweatshirt indicates. And just a moment to recognize our sponsor. If you like what you see in terms of the line of clothing of Spiritual Gangster, it's one of the many product lines that you can find at pureathletics.ca, PUUR athletics.ca. And we're very grateful for the support of that sponsor. While I'm expressing gratitude, I also want to note that the first episode of the Gray Matter podcast dropped yesterday on YouTube. We're already up close to 120 views, which my producer tells me is promising. And I want to thank everyone for supporting the show. Today is the fifth episode that we will have recorded. And I'm very excited today to have a very well-known and very well-respected academic professor, Dr. Rodney Clifton. He's insisted that I call him Rod, which I think is going to give everybody a bit of a sense of who we're talking to, we're going to be talking with and learning from. Dr. Clifton has written a number of books, the most recent of which is one that we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about today, because it's on a very topical issue, one that is very salient in the public mind, but it also transcends just the question of Indian residential schools, and it touches on a lot of undercurrents that are going on within Canadian society, politics, and culture. The book is called From Truth Comes Reconciliation, Assessing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Report. Was published last year. It's authored by Dr. Rodney Clifton and also Mark DeWolf. It's available on Amazon and really any other place that you buy books. As you know, people who watch the program, we start off by framing the discussion in terms of a quotation or two. I'd like to start off with one that's actually in the book, and this is from Senator Murray Sinclair, who really was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He said this: while the TRC, that's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, heard many experiences of unspeakable abuse, we have been heartened by testimonies which affirm the dedication and compassion of committed educators who sought to nurture the children in their care. These experiences must also be heard. And really, that is sort of the theme of the book. The book tells another story, really a truthful story, that has not been heard enough in the public mind, and certainly not in the mass media. Another quotation that I'd like to add is from Marcus Aurelius, and it is, "If it is not right, do not do it. And if it is not true, do not say it." The other quotation I'd like to offer, the last one in terms of framing the discussion, is a concept that comes from a British academic, the late Dr. Roger Scruton, who coined a term called oikophobia. And this ties into part of the message of the book. And the reason why I'm putting this one forth, I think, will become clear as we get into the discussion with Dr. Clifton. Oikophobia. Oikophobia is a combination of two Greek words, oiko meaning home, and of course phobia meaning fear. And here it says xenophobia is fear of the alien. Oikophobia is fear of the familiar, the disposition in any conflict to side with them against us, and the felt need to denigrate the customs, culture, and institutions that are identifiably ours. And part of the discussion we're going to have today is why discussion about Indian residential schools seems to have been necessarily framed as a criticism and an attack upon, let's call it the greater Canadian populace, and more than that, upon what have been time-honored customs, traditions, and cultural norms in our society. What is this self-loathing part of dealing with Indian residential schools? Is it a necessary part of the discussion? And is it true? and does it lead to reconciliation? These are questions that Dr. Rodney Clifton is going to try to help us answer. Before I bring him into the conversation, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about who he is, because it's important to understand that he's a very eminent Canadian intellectual. Rodney Clifton is responsible for directing the Frontier Centers, that's the Frontier Center for Public Policy, the research program, and he's a professor emeritus at the University of Manitoba. He's received his Bachelor of Education and Master's of Education from the University of Alberta, which is also my alma mater. He has PhD from the University of Toronto, and he's also received a postgraduate degree from the University of Stockholm. In addition, he has been awarded a Spencer Fellowship from the International Association for Evaluation of Educational Achievement, another award, RH Award from the University of Manitoba, the R.W.B. Jackson Research Award from the Canadian Educational Research Association, as well as both an Edward Sheffield Distinguished Research Awards from the Canadian Society for the Study of Higher Education. He's also written for numerous newspapers and journals, including the Canadian Journal of Education, Policy Options, Sociology of Education, the National Post, and the Winnipeg Free Press. His books include Socioeconomic Status, Attitudes, and Educational Performances, a comparison of students in England and New Zealand, Authority in Classrooms, Cross Currents, Contemporary Canadian Educational Issues and Recent Social Trends in Canada, 1960 to 2000. And his most recent book before the one that we just introduced, which it is called What's Wrong with Our Schools and How We Can Fix Them, which was published in 2010, was written along with Michael Zwagstra and John Long. So here we are. Dr. Clifton, welcome to Grey Matter.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for that gracious introduction, which is turning me red.
Well, we're very pleased to have you here, because you're clearly an authority on a topic which is of great, I think we can agree, is of great importance in not only Canadian culture and politics, but also Canadian history, because as I see it, and I'm going to get you to talk about this a bit more, what Indian residential schools in Canada, and let's call it the dominant narrative that's emerged from the Sinclair Commission, to a larger degree has led to a rewriting of Canadian history, the toppling of statues of people like Sir John A. Macdonald, for example, signals something very disturbing and perhaps dangerous in our society, which I've not witnessed in my lifetime. I dare say perhaps not even in yours. Before we get into your book, I want to let the listeners know, people tuning in, that I've actually read this book. I have read more than one book, but I've read this book, and I actually had the honor of writing a foreword to the book. And before we get into it, I'd like to read the foreword to the book that I wrote. I started with a quotation from Voltaire, which many people will know, which reads, "I may disagree with what you say, but I shall defend to the death your right to speak it." And then my foreword goes on to read as follows. "Having reflected carefully upon From Truth Comes Reconciliation, I am convinced that it is an important historical work. I say this for three principal reasons. Firstly, it pays tribute to the many dedicated men and women who worked at Indian residential schools throughout much of the last century, the vast majority of whom did no harm to any of the children in their care. The many lifetimes of service made by these individuals are unjustly overshadowed by the now well-known atrocities committed against IRS students. Secondly, the book questions binary thinking about Indian residential schools. My own grandmother spent much of her childhood at the Brandon IRS. She passed away in 2018 at the fine age of 98, although having been born on February 29th, 1920, she would have insisted that she was still in her prime and not yet 25. Grandma credited the staff at the IRS with educating her, providing her with proper morals, and even training her to become a nurse, a vocation in which she served during World War II until she met and married my grandfather in 1940. Stories like hers are far from unique and may in fact be more representative of the reality of the IRS experience than the victimhood narrative that is foundational to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. Finally, this book is an expression of free speech that will offend people. In so doing, it will challenge their preconceived ideas about Indian residential schools, about truth, and about the meaning of reconciliation. If there is to be restoration to friendly relations, or the making of one view or belief compatible with another, then we must first abandon the postmodernist infatuation with the pretense of taking moral responsibility to make amends for the past. Reconciliation is not about laying blame or demanding that the other side take a knee. That is capitulation, not reconciliation. In order for there to be true reconciliation in the proper sense of the word, there must first be understanding and a respect for a diversity of opinions and viewpoints about the legacy of Indian residential schools. Only through an examination of all sides of the question can we reach a true understanding of what occurred and why. And it is from that intellectual and historical plateau that we may yet see our way clear to truth and reconciliation. So that's the foreword I wrote to the book. So I think it's very clear my stated bias in favor of it as a historical work. And I've also stated what I think is that it tells a very important story. And I say that not only because obviously I've revealed that I do have an indigenous heritage, I am a status Indian, but also I'm not a neophyte to Indian residential schools. I was a lawyer who represented hundreds of people in the original Indian residential schools class action, and I represented many of them in the IAP hearings, in which I heard the anecdotal stories of great atrocities and abuse. And so I come to this topic in that context, really having seen all of the abuse. And so when I read the book, it was a revelation. It was eye-opening. And it challenged many of my own preconceived notions about Indian residential schools and about the whole concept of truth and reconciliation. So let's come to Dr. Clifton. I've talked enough. We've got a great guest on. We want to hear from him. He's the authority. He's the expert. He's the author of the book. So, Dr. Clifton, what I'd like to do, we've talked through your resume, but I'd be interested to know, and I'm sure the people tuning in would be interested to know something of your, personal and professional biography. Could you take us back to your, early school days and where you're from and what led you to become a professor at the University of Manitoba?
Yeah, it's a long story like your story as well. I grew up in Jasper, which is in Alberta, and I wanted to become a teacher, so I went to the University of Alberta and I went into the Faculty of Education in 1964. And when I was starting to be trained as a teacher, there was an interest in a program that was called cross-cultural education, and it was to prepare people to go on to Indian reserves and Métis colonies in Alberta and to teach those children. And I was interested in that, so I joined that program. And one of the requirements of the program was to do an internship. And my internship, I was scheduled to go to the Blackfoot Reserve, the Siksika First Nation in southern Alberta, 100 kilometers east of Calgary, and that's where I was assigned. So when I went there in 1966, 2 years after beginning university and studying education, I went to the Blackfoot Reserve. I had enough money, so I bought a car, and it went and was put into the nurses or the teachers wing of Old Sun Residential School, which was the Anglican school on the reserve, and it was very close to the Indian what they called the Indian office, the offices of Indian Affairs. Most of the people who worked in this office were, the people who worked in this office were a mixture of Blackfoot and white people. And my job was to be a go-for, to get things and do things for people. So I was registering children for kindergarten. I was helping hand out the $5 on Indian days and the treaty money. I helped put up some of the teepees for the Sundance that was going to be held in August, and I did work with farmers and ranchers, branding cattle, haying, rounding up cattle, all kinds of things like that. And the basic objective was to become familiar with indigenous people so that when you moved into being a teacher in this area, you would have a good background in terms of the people that you're working with. I met my wife during that period of time. We didn't get married for 2 years, but her name was Leighton A. Youngman. It was a very famous Blackfoot family. And 2 years later, we got married in 1968. So we've been married almost 54 years, which is quite a long time. It's gone quickly. Towards the end of the summer, I was to be paid a stipend by Indian Affairs. Indian Affairs is very slow in paying, and at the end of the middle of August, I didn't have any money to go back to university. Now, my parents would have lent me money or given me money to go to university, but I saw in the Anglican Journal, this was the Anglican residential school, that they needed a senior boys supervisor at Stringer Hall, which was in Inuvik. So I applied for that job and I got it. It was, and so I drove home to Jasper. I got packed up and my parents took me to Edmonton and put me on a plane. And 12 hours later, I was in Inuvik after having stopped flying in a DC-3 or DC-4, I forget which, but quite a small propeller-driven plane, stopping at all of the milk run stops from Edmonton, going to about 100 kilometers from the Arctic coast, all the way up there. Inuvik is about 400 kilometers on the other side of the Arctic Circle, so it's pretty far north, and it's about 100 kilometers from Tuktoyaktuk, which is on the coast.
Was it light or dark when you got up there?
It was August, so it was getting darker, and it was getting colder. And good thing I had my winter coat with me because it was cold enough to wear a winter coat. And I remember walking around in the old town in Inuvik, and there was a little kid with a pair of shorts on, a little Aboriginal kid with a pair of shorts on and bare feet and stamping the ice out on a mud puddle, right? And I thought, oh my God, I wonder if I'm going to be able to survive this. But I'm a Canadian and I grew up in Alberta, so it can be pretty cold there too. But these kids were tough. So in Inuvik, then I was responsible for 85 kids in senior boys from the ages of 12 to 22, and I was 21 at that time. So some of the boys, a few of the boys were older than I was, in 3 dorms. And the hostel was separate from the school. So the school, Sir Alexander Mackenzie School, was a public school, and it was divided into a Roman Catholic section and a Protestant section, in which even Jewish kids went to the Protestant section. And the kids lived in the residence, which was a couple of hundred meters away from the school. I was on duty 6 days a week, 22 hours a day. Now, some of that time I could sleep, and some of that time the kids were at school. But if there were ill kids, then they would be in the dorm. If they were in the with the nurse in the, oh my gosh, what is it? in the room where they kept children that were sick, that were too sick to be in the dorms.
In the infirmary?
In the infirmary, yes, in the infirmary. We got it. You got it. See, you've read some more books than you
I
actually.
told you I was smarter than I look, Doctor. You got to trust me, which isn't saying much.
You got me up on that one. You dug me out. Yeah. So it was, and I spent a year up there working with those children, looking after them. And during that year, I met a anthropologist by name of John, and two anthropologists, in fact, John and Irma Honigman, who were doing a book on the Inuit and the integration of the Inuit, which were called Eskimos at that time, of course, into urban society. So it's called, something like that. I'll remember it, the name of the book. And I was collecting data on the residential school, on the children, how old they were, where they came from, who their siblings were, how fast they were learning English, whether they could learn English, whether they had problems. And they helped me collect data, which I wrote a long manuscript, a couple of hundred pages of notes and records on these children, and a couple of hundred photographs of the children in both the residence, as well as playing in the playground, as well as doing sports, as well as all kinds of other community things that were going on there. So that's how I got started in this. And then in 1968, Elaine and I got married. She was just on the phone, and she had gone to Old Sun Residential School for 10 years and had lived in the Old Sun School, most of it attending class in Old Sun, but some of it being bussed out to other schools in southern Alberta. So that's in a nutshell the story.
Can I just back up one step?
Sure.
Rod, can I call you Rod?
Yes, please.
Rod, obviously there was something that drew you to or attracted you to working with indigenous youth, and was there something in particular that made you want to work to go out to places like Siksika and for heaven's sakes go all the way up to Inuvik? I'm sure it wasn't a Johnny Horton song. So what drew you to this vocation of teaching indigenous youth?
I grew up in the school that I went to. There was indigenous children that were going to that school, and I was always interested and had them as friends and playmates when I was young. So I was always interested in these children, and I had interacted with them. So I knew about Métis colonies in Alberta. I knew about, the difficulties that the children had. So that was one of the reasons that I went into this cross-cultural education program, is because I really wanted to do something like that. And I have done that. So the summer after, though, before we're getting married, I went to Uranium City. I was hired as a beach supervisor there, and Uranium City was a company town, but most of the kids who come to the beach to learn how to swim and to swim were the indigenous kids that lived there, because the white kids often went out in the summer, most often because they had jobs with Eldorado, and Eldorado had a plane and they flew the families out to Edmonton. So I spent the summer teaching indigenous children in Uranium City how to swim and how to keep safe around water. I don't know. I was just interested in these people and this their education.
And so after leaving Inuvik, I take it that probably would have been in the early 1970s when you left?
67.
Okay.
Centennial year.
Okay. That was when you left Inuvik?
Yeah, I just spent one winter, one academic year in Inuvik looking after these children.
And then did you immediately go back to the university to pursue your master's degree?
No, I went to finish off. I had only 2 years of education then, so I had another 2 years to do.
I see.
So 67, I went to summer school. I had quite a bit of money. I was getting $300 a month, and I only had to pay $50 a month board and room to stay in the residential school. I could hardly sleep because there were lots of kids and lots of things going on. But nevertheless, I went back and finished the third year, and then Elaine and I got married, and then I went back. A fellow who was a teacher of mine was starting up a program in Alberta called New Start, and he was interested in hiring teachers, and so he thought that I could get a job. That Elaine and I interviewed for the job. We didn't get it, so we had to make a quick decision and go back. I went back to university, and she started working at the University Library in Edmonton. So then I finished off my bachelor's degree and then went directly into a master's degree. At the master's level, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask you. I think I jumped the gun there. I wanted to ask you about your master's thesis and what you wrote it on. But before we go there, I don't want to gloss over this too much. When you were up north, you actually lived in a residential school.
Yes.
For an entire summer, for entire winter, or how long were you there?
Okay, so I lived in the residential school on the Blackfoot Reserve, Old Sun, for the summer from May, the beginning of May, until the end of August. And then when I went to Inuvik, I lived in Stringer Hall from the third week in August to the first week of July the next summer. So 18 months altogether, I think.
So what was it about those experiences that you remember the most? What were the most striking, indelible impressions that sort of came with you out of that 18 months? Obviously, you're a very young man, and sort of getting out into the world and seeing parts of the world that many people only exist in people's imaginations.
Yes.
So how did that strike you? How did that help you form your personality, both as a student and then ultimately as a career academic?
I was in elementary education, so I was very interested in children that were quite young, and I found the children to be absolutely delightful. Both in Old Sun, when I went there, there were still children living in the residential school. There was 3 Cree girls from Hobima that were living there. They were orphans, and they were living there, and they lived in Old Sun over the summer with Hilda Redgun coming in and looking after them during the day. And the only adults in the school was Father Brown and myself, the Anglican priest for the reserve. And so I got to know these children quite well over that summer. And when I went to Inuvik, there were lots of little kids, and many of the Inuit children didn't speak a word of English. So I made an arrangement with these really unbelievably good kids. And you can see pictures of these children on the front of our book. The little boy at the middle was one of those Inuit children that was in Inuvik. And pictures of myself and the children at walks, and pictures also of Mark DeWolf's experience on the Blood Reserve when his father was the principal of St. Paul's, and he went to school with these children. So Mark and I have had somewhat similar experiences in that. What affected me the most was how pleasant these children were, and how interested they were in learning, and how adaptable they were. I made arrangements with the Inuit children that I would teach them how to speak English. Of course, they were getting English in school, but I would help them learn English if they taught me how to speak Inuktitut. So by Christmas time, they could speak English pretty well. They could get around. We would try to encourage them to speak English in the residential school. But there was also two Inuit supervisors who would speak to the children in Inuktitut, and that would help them. And so by Christmas they could speak English, and all I could do is say things that I wasn't supposed to say in Inuktitut that they had taught me, and they would come to me and they would say it, Mr. Clifton, say it, Mr. Clifton, and I would say these words in Inuktitut, and they would kill themselves laughing about my accent and that I'm saying something that I shouldn't be saying in to them or to anybody else, and they thought this was so funny. And then they would say, funny, Mr. Clifton, funny, Mr. Clifton, and then go away laughing. And that reminds me that sometimes the kids would be speaking in Inuktitut. 70% of the children in Inuvik in Stringer Hall were Inuit because the Anglicans had evangelized the coast, and the Roman Catholics had evangelized the Mackenzie Delta and the Mackenzie River. So only about 25% of the children were Dene children in Stringer Hall, and about 15% were white children, because in the north, all the kids who lived in small communities went to residential school, because there were nothing past grade 6 in some of these small communities, and in hunting camps and fishing camps and things like that, there were no schools at all. So the children came to residential school. So we had a mixture of 70% Inuit kids, and the young Inuit children who come from small communities didn't speak a word of English when they came there. They only spoke Inuktitut. Now their brothers and sisters that were older would be able to speak English because they learned that, and they learned it very quickly. Most of the Dene kids from the Mackenzie Delta and the Mackenzie River spoke English pretty well, though they also spoke their own Dene languages. And then the white kids only spoke English. But many of the children and the people that worked in the residential school used Inuk expressions and facial expressions. So you would raise your eyebrows to say yes, you would crinkle up your nose to say no, so you could have a conversation with somebody without actually saying any words. And that was something that I learned. So these kids were absolutely amazing kids. I got pictures of them, and I still remember them very fondly, and look at the pictures.
So by the time you left there to go back to university and to finish off your Bachelor's of Education degree, you'd had this immersive experience really in northern indigenous culture, and you'd fallen in love with a Blackfoot girl. Yes. So really your life is pretty well framed. I think we've established that you're not a racist. Which is good.
Well, it's better than white people. We call that in Blackfoot. We call them Nabiguans. So I like 6 better than Nabiguans.
Right. So I want to talk about when you decided to enter the world of academia. So did you go and pursue your master's immediately after completing your Bachelor's of Education degree, or did you get out and teach for a while?
I taught in central part of Edmonton as a substitute teacher during the springs, because I got, after my second year, I got my teaching certificate. So at that time you could get an interim's teaching certificate after you finish 2 years of university, and there were all kinds of opportunities to get people to go right out to teach after that, because there were teachers needed. But I wanted to finish off my bachelor's degree, and I did that. And we had been married. Elaine and I got married in 68, and I finished that by 69. And I had good grades, so they were bringing people into the master's program at the University of Alberta, and I applied for that and got accepted. So we decided to stay in Edmonton and not go out teaching, and I would continue to teach in the spring after university and finish a master's degree. So I did a master's on indigenous education, and it was
Ah,
a study of children integrated into um, into a school division close to uh, the Hobbema Reserve, um, and integrated into the system. So we had children coming from Hobbema and going to the public school system, which was quite common at that time. It started about the end of the beginning of the 1950s to integrate children into the public systems rather than having separated residential schools or day schools on reserves. And these were a group of children that had recently been integrated. So I was interested in finding out what their attitudes towards school were, what their attitudes towards integration was, and how they were integrating into the system. I had to get permission from the band council and the chief on Hobbema and the superintendent at the Ponoka school, where Ponoka division, where they were being integrated into. So I did a study of those children integrating into public school systems.
so did you immediately go into your doctoral studies after that, after completing your master's?
Yes, I found out that I was doing quite well, and that I then applied for a doctoral program at the University of Toronto, and I got accepted and I got funding. So we decided to go to Toronto, which was a big break for both of us. Coming from Alberta and living most of my life in Alberta, and Elaine living most of her life and traveling around, and a little bit to Saskatchewan, a little bit to Banff, down to Montana, where there's Blackfeet, and they would go to sun dances and Indian days around, but never gone as far away as Toronto. So when we were going to Toronto, this was a big excursion for both of us. Now, she did very well adapting to Toronto. I really didn't like Toronto very well because we were living downtown and it was busy and hot in the summertime and dirty and noisy, and I wasn't used to all of that. But we stayed there for 2 years, and then I got a job at Memorial University in Newfoundland. So we went to Memorial University in Newfoundland.
We just spoke with Memorial grad not too long ago, Mr. Brian Peckford.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yes. Very fascinating man. Just backing up a step, though, Rod. What was the focus of your doctoral thesis?
I looked at the integration of the socialization of graduate students into graduate studies at universities in Ontario. So my advisor, Ted Harvey, had done a big study of graduate students in faculties of graduate studies in 3 universities in Ontario, and I used that data set to look at the integration of graduate students. And what I found out was that self-motivation is a greater facilitator of becoming a competent student and then a competent academic than the institution that you go through or the sponsorship that you get. So it was quite contrary-minded to what advisors were thinking in terms of their importance in socializing graduate students. So more independence rather than sponsorship by other academics.
Right. So just listening to your history, I'm struck a little bit by the analogy to something that I've read recently. I recently read a biography of Dr. Charles Darwin, and you're probably aware of this, but I suspect many people aren't. Charles Darwin was a young man who was going to enter the ministry. He was going to be a parson. He had the opportunity to go on a trip on a merchant marine ship that actually went and visited the Galapagos Islands.
Yeah.
And of course, what Charles Darwin did, he was a very curious a very inquisitive young man. And of course, he made a bunch of sketches and notebooks of all the things that he had seen. And he was so struck by the wonders of the natural world that he had seen during his trip that he spent the whole rest of his life writing about those experiences. And it seems to me that to some degree you are along the same path. These very stark experiences that you had as a young man, as a young student, sort of led you through on a path where you became very fascinated by the indigenous peoples and cultures, wanted to learn more about them, and also wanted to understand. I suspect, started asking questions like what are the best ways to educate indigenous peoples,
Yes.
while still respecting their cultural traditions. For example, that little vignette that you related to us about this cultural exchange of language, I think says a great deal about you, and about sort of the way that you approached with great deference and respect these indigenous people and
Yes.
their cultural traditions. So coming back to your doctoral thesis, after you'd finished that work, did you immediately enter academia? Is that when you went to the University of Manitoba and began your work there?
No, I went to Memorial University first. So
All right.
my first job was Memorial University, and when I was at Memorial University, then I got a fellowship to go to the University of Stockholm. They were looking for people that could do analysis of big data sets. So they had this big international data set, and I had computer skills that I could analyze these data. So I got a fellowship to go there. So we went there, and our son was born in Stockholm at the Karolinska Institute, which is the institute where the people sit down to decide on the Nobel Prizes. So he's probably the only Blackfoot that is ever born in Stockholm and in the Karolinska Institute. Yeah.
How long were you over in Sweden then?
1 year. It took me 2 years to write the dissertation that I wrote, the book that I had to write for the degree that I was studying for, and I went back and defended it a year later.
And how did you end up then at the University of Manitoba?
Okay, so we were from the West, and Newfoundland is closer to England than it is to Alberta, where we come from. And there was a job opening up at the University of Manitoba, and I applied for it, and I got accepted. So we moved back west, and we've been at Manitoba from 1979 till now. Yeah.
What was the focus of your teaching initially at the University of Manitoba?
I was teaching in the Faculty of Education, so I taught a number of courses. I taught a course that was called Social Foundations of Education, of which Aboriginal education was a part of it. That is, how do you deal with children that have different languages and different cultures when they come to public schools, or when we set up in Manitoba separate schools, Roman Catholic schools, or Mennonite schools, or private schools, or those sorts of things. And how do teachers deal with that kind of variability in their classrooms, and how empathetic and sympathetic should they be to their children? Should they be an automaton that comes in and doesn't take that into consideration, or should they be very interested in where the children come from? Obviously, the second position is the strongest position in that, but that was a debate. So I taught those kinds of things, and then I taught research methods courses to education students. How do you do research? How do you answer questions? And how do you answer questions so that policies can come out of it that will make the world a better place, schools a better place for children, and for all children, not just for any one set of children, but for all children.
I spent about 8 years at the university. Obviously, you've been there much longer. When I was at university, I was in the faculties of arts, studied in humanities, but also law. And I found that the overall intellectual tenor of the university was decidedly leftist. And I note that there was a recent survey that was done of academics in North America, Canada, and the United States, where only about 2% of those professors polled, identified as conservative, and the rest either were staunchly liberal or leftist. So what I want to know from you is, during your time at the university, have you found that the culture, that life and culture at the university in that respect has changed during the time of your tenure?
Absolutely. When I was a student, I studied in both the Faculty of Arts as well as education. I took many philosophy courses and many sociology courses, and that was sociology was my substantive subject discipline. And while it was leaning towards the left, it was central left, and there was a great degree of respect for conservatives, and there was a greater degree of respect for argumentation and having argumentation. And I remember a very famous psychologist coming to the University of Alberta and giving a talk upon the genetic basis of the inheritance of intelligence. And it was an open forum, and there were hundreds of people there, and you could hear the lecture, and the debate was all above board. There was no pulling of fire alarms or protests or threats or anything like that. So now we've gone into a position where it's really difficult to be conservative, and to be particularly a conservative Christian in a secular university in Canada.
I'm interested to know how you got involved with your work with the Frontier Center for Public Policy, and then segue into your writing, and specifically the book that we want to talk about today. So could you tell people a little bit about the Frontier Center for Public Policy? I think, as you know, letting the cat out of the bag, I'm a senior fellow of the Frontier Center for Public Policy. I publish there regularly. I'm a great admirer of the people who publish there, and I think it's a wonderful source of truth for Canadians and for anyone who's interested in knowing having a more reliable account of what's going on in our world today, especially in the world of ideas. But I have the sense that you're one of the people who was there foundationally on the ground floor of creating the Frontier Center. So I'm interested in hearing that story of how you got involved in the foundation of the Frontier Center for Public Policy.
I started writing in the mid-90s in the public policy area. So policy options, other journals that were related to policy. And then I started writing for the Winnipeg Free Press and submitting articles for there. And then through that, I met with Peter Hawley, who was trying to set up, or beginning to set up, the Frontier Center. And since universities were becoming much more closed to people that were central right, this seemed like a natural fit of the shoe. So I started doing some work with the Frontier Center, sitting on the board, helping generate projects, helping get other people involved, and helping editing and writing for the center. So it began about 1996 or 1997, and it's been like that ever since. That I've been either an employee at some times, not employed, depending upon the funding. Now, think tanks are where the good ideas, I think, are coming out of. The good ideas that are contrary-minded to the leftish ideas that are generally coming out of university. Now, we do have obviously some centralists in universities, but we have more centralists and more people on the right, on the conservative side of the agenda in the Canadian think tanks. Frontier Center is a relatively small think tank. It focuses in on generally Western Canada and in on a certain set of policy ideas, of which Aboriginal issues has been from the very beginning one of its focuses. And it's put out some interesting and important pieces on Aboriginal education, Aboriginal reserves, fee simple housing, and other kinds of ideas that would empower Aboriginal people to become better integrated into the economic system of Canada and have more control over their own lives.
It's interesting what you say about think tanks. It reminds me of something I recently heard, a podcast where Preston Manning was being interviewed, and he was talking about, let's say, well, to be frank, he was talking about the mediocrity of Canadian political leadership right now. And he was drawing kind of an interesting analogy. His grandsons in hockey, who I guess are very fine hockey players. And he was noting that, when he goes around to the rinks with his grandsons, there's all kinds of scouts trying to find these future Bobby Orrs and Wayne Gretzkys and Connor McDavids. But he says, politically speaking, there's nobody going around and looking at the think tanks to find, the upcoming promising talent that could be part of maybe the next Stephen Harper in Canadian politics. That really there just doesn't seem to be the same desire to find the future stars of Canadian politics. And this is something that really has changed dramatically in his time. And he recommended a couple of things in terms of trying to change this trend. Was to look more to think tanks for people who could step into politics with meaningful, deep ideas, deep thinkers who could really make a significant impact in Canadian politics. That was one part of it. And he also mentioned that we need to get into the grassroots of education and change things really at the grassroots, because he thinks that there aren't enough young people getting involved in sort of intellectual movements, let alone organized politics. So just as an aside, I just mentioned that because when you were talking about think tanks and the ideas that really forward-thinking ideas that come out of them, Preston Manning seems to agree with you. And in fact, his party, the Reform Party, the way he described its foundation, it really began as a sort of a think tank, didn't it?
Yeah. The three of us went down in 1988 or before then and met with Preston Manning in the hotel room. Now, he was at University of Alberta a few years before me, and obviously I knew who he was, and I knew his father because his father was a premier during the time I was in university. And he was talking about, creating the Reform Party, and the three of us who left there academics, we went and had a beer after that, and we said, geez, it's a very good idea, but there's not a hope in hell that this is ever going to light a fire under anybody's backside to get it done. So we were so wrong on that. He really did make a big difference in the way politics was handled in Canada. And I think his point about young people not being mentored into political careers and into being staffers for political people is a very good point. And I think the place to look is think tanks, and if think tanks had more resources to hire junior researchers, that would be the way to get these young people groomed and prepared for jobs that are important in Canadian society. Yeah, really thinking about policies. And I'm quite concerned about the federal Liberals and the NDP getting together and supporting each other for the next 3 or 4 years, and moving so far to the left that probably we're going to be breaking our children or grandchildren's piggy banks to pay for it for a long period of time. And we really do need a good argument about how best to develop our country and our provinces.
His point, which kind of ties into yours, is that he thinks that the elitists come in and take over when we stop getting involved in politics at the grassroots level. In other words, I think it was Churchill who said, character is what is revealed when no one's looking. And Preston Manning's point is that right now no one's watching, no one's buying the store. And so this is what's happening is we're not involved at the grassroots level. And so the ideologues are coming in, and really no one's offering any resistance. And so we see these ideas coming through all of our cherished institutions, even though many of these ideas are anathema to Canadian culture and to what most, let's say, right-thinking Canadians would hold as true. So from there, I want to segue into your book.
Thank you.
Here's the starting point for this. It's a largely untold true story of Indian residential schools in Canada. That's the way I read the book. And just as an aside, as somebody who has studied history and who is not an academic, but somebody who has read a lot of academic texts, the thing that I look for most when I'm reading a book like this is the extent to which it's supported by data. And I think one of the strengths of this book is that it's very carefully researched. Everything that's put forth in the book, and I think from talking with you for the last hour or so, we've understood why. You're a data geek. You're a researcher, and so that comes through very clearly in the book. But let's start with this. For those people who are not familiar with it, could you explain sort of what the Sinclair Commission was and what its role was and what its purpose was and what its main findings were?
Okay, so the commission was actually called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was struck in 2009, and it reported in 2015. So it took 6 years to gather all the data, and they wrote 7 volumes of material, 3,500 pages. And all the data that we've got in our book actually comes from the TRC Commission report. So if anybody's going to criticize the evidence that we present in our book, they would be actually criticizing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report itself, because all the data comes exactly from that report. Now, we cross-checked those data with our own collection of data from public archives and from Indian Affairs archives, from church archives, from our own data, including the data that I collected in Inuvik, was cross-checked. But everything is supported by evidence from the TRC Commission report. The commission was to report, and it developed out of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, which reported in 1996. And so one of the recommendations in that Royal Commission report was that there should be a commission that looks into the scope and nature of what are called the Indian residential schools in Canada, and these success and last success of children coming through those schools. It took 6 years to complete. It spent in total $72 million in gathering the information and having community presentations and things of that nature, and of coming up with this 3,500 page report, 1.5 million words in the report. So it's quite a long, detailed report. I don't think very many people, besides myself and Mark DeWolf, have actually read the whole report and made notes in the report. Some of the volumes have got indexes, and some of the volumes don't have indexes. So it took a lot of work, about 5 years of work, to sort through there and to figure out exactly what the major points are. So one of the chapters that Mark and I have written is a summary of the report, and we've got 29 questions that we ask. How many children went to the residential school? Were children forbidden from speaking native languages in the school? How many kids died in the schools? What did they die of if they died at the schools? And things of that nature. So we wrote about 10,000, 12,000 words, summarizing the main points in the report.
So,
our summary is quite different than what the TRC summary is, though.
Right, and that's what I want to come to next. And correct me if this is wrong, but I mean these recommendations have had a significant impact upon Canadian law and institutions over the past 10 or 12 years. And what I see in in those recommendations, at least the way they've been translated into law, is that a seed was germinated in that report of let's call it critical race theory,
yes,
which has been used as a basis to found the claim that Canada is a systemically racist nation. And I know from reading the book that this is something that you would take issue with and disagree with.
Yeah.
But we're seeing now, for example, Bill C-67 in Ontario, and we're seeing these concepts taught in our schools and universities. So what I'd like to know is, based upon your careful review of that report and those million words, is that concept of what the Sinclair Commission or the Truth and Reconciliation report says, is that based accurately upon the data that is in the report?
Our summary is based accurately on the data, and anybody that wanted to take the time could actually read the report and compare it to what actually we say. And we've footnoted everything that we said to you, so you can easily get to the volume and to the page where those. And we think that the report itself is pretty not too bad in terms of its centralist position. It certainly got, strong condemnations of some things that went on, and some things are certainly questionable in terms of whether they actually happened or not that are in the report. For example, the evidence that Doris Young brings that she observed a child in the Bertle school being murdered and then the body being put into the furnace, is something that was presented to the commission, but we were quite surprised to see that the commission, which contained two lawyers, Wilton Littlechild, who him and I went to university together, we knew each other, and he dated my wife's sister for a time, and Murray Sinclair were both lawyers, and they didn't refer this to the RCMP, and they never referred it to the Crown prosecutors to take a really good assessment of whether it in fact happened or not, but it's in the report. So we don't know whether it happened or not. I think not, obviously, for a whole bunch of reasons, but I think because parents would have complained about a child not coming back from residential school. The child went to residential school, and many of the kids in the South would go to residential school on Sunday evening or Sunday morning when their parents went to church, which was in the chapel in the residential school, and then they would stay in the school for the weekend. They would come back home on Friday. So if a child didn't come home on Friday, I'm sure parents would ask their band council, the Indian agent, reported to the RCMP, other things, wondering where their child was. And also, I think that you couldn't have children missing because of the funding of the residential schools was based upon certification of the number of children that were there. So if the Anglican Church was running a residential school and they said they had 130 kids in the school, then they had to have quarterly reports with the names and with the children that were actually in the school, and Indian Affairs would only pay for kids that were actually in the school. And the third point that doesn't make any sense to me is that on Indian days and treaty days, parents would take their children and they would go for their treaty money, and they wouldn't get $5 if they said they had 10 children, but they only had 5 of them there and 5 of them were missing. So they couldn't actually get the 5 times the 10, which would be $50 instead of the 5 times 5, $25. So I think lots of people would have known that children were missing if they were ever missing. And I think that would have been flagged away before this period of time. So I'm pretty skeptical of unmarked graves and buried children.
So you're talking there about the Kamloops IRS situation that was so much in the news about a year ago.
Yeah, and the other ones that have been popping up since then. Now on the Blackfoot Reserve, where my wife comes from, and we spent quite a bit of time. The cemetery for the Anglicans is about a 1.5 kilometers or 2 kilometers from the school, and about 80 or 90% of the graves there are unmarked in total. So there's ones that go way back to the 1800s, and it's just like wild prairies. And more recent burials would have a dirt mound, but sometimes there wouldn't even be a marker. There would be a plastic marker that the funeral home had put, or a wooden cross, but those things got destroyed or deteriorated over time. So there's many graves there that are unmarked and uncared for. It turns back into prairie grass pretty quickly after 20 years or so.
I want to come back to part of what's in your book, and this is concerning the massive amounts of anecdotal data that was collected by the commission. It's my understanding that much of the anecdotal data, in fact, maybe most of it, in terms of the anecdotal stories from IRS, former IRS students graduated, was that these stories were overwhelmingly positive, and that they weren't all stories of horrific abuse, which is the story that has been portrayed both in the mass media and, of course, used to political advantage by certain political parties in Canada. Is that true, based upon your analysis of the data?
It's certainly a lot more mixed than what is reported in mainstream press, and certainly Elaine's parents came to Winnipeg to participate in the Anglican apology, which was held at Manaki Lodge in Ontario, and they flew in here and then were bussed out to Manaki Lodge. And we went out on Wednesday. They were supposed to stay a week, and they said that they had to come. It was so highly politicized and so highly emotional that it was very hard to give a contrary opinion. So Elaine and I went out on a Wednesday in the summer and stayed for the day, and then brought her parents back to our house in Winnipeg. And Elaine's mom, who was in residential school for 8 years in Old Sun before Elaine, she said, well, what are people crying over spilt milk, over things that have gone on in the past? And I said, well, what good things did you learn in residential school? And she was sitting behind me. I was driving the car, and she said, well, I'm talking to you, aren't I? Which means that she learned English in residential school, and she could communicate. And my father-in-law, Arthur, when he retired as a rancher and farmer, became an Anglican priest for the reserve. And so his understanding of scripture and his understanding of people and the work that he was doing were things that he learned in residential school. And in fact, burying people and putting markers on their graves is, not surprisingly, a Christian thing and not an Aboriginal thing. So the way people were buried before, and I saw one of these burial places. The Blackfoot put their corpses on scaffolds in bluffs of trees or along the rivers and trees, and they deteriorated in that sort of way and went back into nature in that sort of way. So it's quite ironic that people are wondering why there's no marked graves. Well, thank Christianity for giving you that kind of tradition to mark your graves and to bury people in the ground, right?
Right.
So what do you do in the middle of winter?
Yeah. So obviously there's an important part of the IRS history that is not being revealed or by the media and is not being taught in our schools and universities. And I take it that's what sort of inspired you, or was the impetus for you writing this book. Is that right? Okay.
Yes.
And so when did you and Professor Wolf decide to write this book?
Mark DeWolf is a school teacher, an actual school teacher for all his career. So he worked in the Department of Education in Halifax and taught school there, and then taught school in Singapore for a number of years. So I knew about him because his father had married Elaine's aunt and uncle, the Gladstones, Horace Gladstone, who is James Gladstone's son, and James Gladstone was the first Indian senator, who we used to call the senator, just the senator. It was the only senator that was of any value, was the senator, Senator James Gladstone, and had also married Hugh Dempsey and Pauline Gladstone, who are also related to her in a family way, and they participated in the Calgary Stampede, and Elaine had done that all her life virtually. So we knew all of these people, and we knew that Reverend DeWolf had married Hugh and Pauline, and had married Horace and Aileen. And Aileen Gladstone was originally Aileen Youngman, which is Elaine's maiden name. So it's all related. So I knew about him, and then I knew that he was making presentations at some of the open sessions, and was getting some flack for being a white person that had gone to Indian residential schools, of which there's quite a few of those kinds of people, because the Indian agent and teachers' kids would have in the most remote schools would have gone to school with the other children. And so on the Blood Reserve, he went to St. Paul's along with, and so did his brothers and sisters go to St. Paul's along with the Kainai children.
So obviously, when you set out to write this book, and the book is called "From Truth Comes Reconciliation: An Assessment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Report," authored by Dr. Clifton, and also by is it Dr. DeWolf?
Mark DeWolf.
Mr. DeWolf. Mr. DeWolf. So when the two of you set out to write this book, I take it you must have had some inkling that this was going to be a controversial work.
It became clearer and clearer as we've got into it further. First of all, Jaime Rubenstein and I, who is another co-author of the book, in 2015 wrote a response to the Truth and Reconciliation report. The summary report was published first, and so there was an article about it in the National Post, and we responded to that article and saying, no, hold it, don't jump onto the bandwagon that says that everything was negative in residential schools, and take a more careful look at. at what was happening in the schools and what is being said about the schools. Well, we got into a lot of flack on that. We got a response, and we got a petition from 1,300 academics across the country taking after us for speaking with a forked tongue, speaking out of both sides of our mouths and saying things that we shouldn't be saying about the holy grail of the study of residential schools. And we're pretty determined, so we dug in our heels and kept responding. So we wrote a second article that was published in the National Post talking about how we were treated as a result of what we said the first time. So that really set the polarization up. And then because of that, a number of people were antagonistic towards us, but a number of people sent us emails and said that, geez, they thought similar to us. And so then we put together the small group of 9 people that wrote the chapters in our book.
So it's been received by at least 1,300 people. I doubt that many of them. I doubt that many people read the book and were willing to criticize it. But obviously, it's been publicly received with some controversy. But is that the only feedback that you've received about the book, or has it been received in other quarters with more in a more welcoming way as a work of history?
Yeah, it's been received in other quarters in a more welcoming way. In Amazon, there are 30 reviews of the book, and the reviews go from 1 star to 5 stars, and our average is 4.9 with 30 reviews. Now, many books have got many more reviews than that, and we've got innumerable email from people all over Canada and the United States who have read the book and sent us emails and said, thank God you're writing this. We think you're on the right track. We had interaction with Senator Lynn Byack, and she was very positive about what we were saying. It was not much different from what she had said. I wrote one chapter in the book, a response to the primate of the Anglican Church, my church, who was very negative, and wrote an open letter to Senator Byack, taking her to task for saying that not everything was negative in residential school. I sent it to the primate. I never got a response from the primate. I've been deplatformed from speaking at the University of Winnipeg. I was only going to speak a few years ago about the names of the schools. And surprisingly to many people, because they don't know, but about 40% of the schools, there were 143 schools in total that were in the report. The report says 139, but when I counted them, there were actually 143 schools. That 40% of them had indigenous names. So Assiniboine, Old Sun, Crowfoot, Poundmaker. We can go across the country and pick out all the ones that had. So I was just going to talk at the university about the names of the schools and pointing out, surprisingly, that 40% of the schools didn't have, more schools had indigenous names than had saints' names. Interesting fact that many people don't realize. And then looking at the names in Canada. So Canada is an indigenous name: Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Okotoks. We could just go through hundreds, thousands of names in Canada that are in fact indigenous names. Right. Yeah. So but I got deplatformed. which meant that the faculty club was going to, the fellow who was running the speakers bureau in the faculty club invited me to speak. And when people on the left discovered that I was going to speak only about the names of the schools, they told the faculty club that they would withdraw their membership. And if all these people withdrew their membership, then the faculty club would no longer exist, because there wasn't enough money to actually support it with people that would not withdraw their membership. So you could see the leftish leaning of universities through that. So they had to cancel the presentation, and the person who asked me to come and speak invited me for lunch, and about 3 or 4 other people came to lunch, and we talked about residential schools, but we didn't do a formal presentation on the names of the schools.
So the principal message of the book really is truth, and I think that's the reason for the title, that from the truth comes reconciliation, that really there's no hope of reconciliation, the type of reconciliation that the report purports to be in favor of, unless we're willing to have a discussion about a discourse about the truth. And that's really the point of the book, is in that we can't have this sort of monolithic narrative being presented in the public, because that narrative in and of itself is so fundamentally divisive. Yes. And we need to have this sort of academic discussion. And Rod, we had another academic on this program recently, a very eminent epidemiologist named Dr. Jay Bhattacharya.
Right.
And that program actually it's on YouTube now if you're interested in taking it in. And
I love Dr. Jay.
Yes, you'll be very interested to watch our discussion with him, because the focus of it was much like what we're talking about today. We're talking about science, and he describes science as a dialectical discussion over time. And that really, that applies in the same way to history or sociology or any other type of academic inquiry. And that's really what you're talking about and what your book engages in. But he was talking about how it's so important to have these discussions, because it's through these discussions that we can arrive at not necessarily a consensus, but at least we can get a closer approximation of what the truth is about the matter. In other words, using the strongest steel is forged in hottest fire. Yeah. And so I think the point of your book is the same thing that Dr. Bhattacharya was saying, where of course he was canceled and deplatformed and called a fringe epidemiologist by Dr. Fauci. It seems to me the same thing is happening in the public discourse, and perhaps for the same reasons. And this is where I want to go to next with you, that there's this silencing, this censoring of dissonant opinions about facts. And we should be able to be able to talk about facts, talk about all the facts, and express contrary opinions about them in a respectful way, the way academics have done for centuries, really for millennia, going back to the ancient Greeks. But that's not happening in the public discourse right now in Canada. So what concerns you the most about what you see happening in Canada today in this context? I mean, as someone who's an author and a retired academic professor, a teacher, what's most concerning about what's happening in Canada today in terms of this, let's say, destruction of respectful discourse about ideas?
The disrespect, I think, is the most concerning. I think our side has been quite open to debate. And one of the proposals that we had for the book at the very beginning was to have contrary-minded people and sympathetic people to the other side, to the report, and contrary-minded people sitting down in a seminar and having a seminar where they would have 5 people from their side, we would have 5 people from our side, and we would debate the issue, and then together we would edit a book, pro and con, in terms of the report. So it was fitting into that kind of a model. We would have an introduction and a conclusion that would have been written by the premier people leading each of the teams, and we would have a synthesis then the two perspectives. And when I tried to get people on the other side to join up on this, there was just pure disrespect and condemnation coming from that perspective. And the same sort of response was when I went to the University of Manitoba Press and talked to them about sponsoring the book. They made the case that there wasn't enough Aboriginals authors in the book. Two of the authors are Indigenous people, so 2 out of 9 is about 20%, a little bit higher than 20%. So it was not really a cogent argument. So then the fallback position was the contrary argument. And the concern that Frontier Center had was that if the book comes out, when the book comes out, it will be savagely attacked. Surprisingly, when the book come out, the enemies didn't do anything, so they haven't responded either to the book reviews or to many of the articles that have been written about it. So Barbara Kay in the National Post wrote an article. Conrad Black wrote 3 articles summarizing parts of the book and taking off on some of his. We've got articles, being written and summary and reviews being written across the country, and most of them have been very fair to our perspective. Of course, it can be criticized, but our objective was to get the debate going so that truth would actually be distilled out of the conflict between two ideologically disparate positions on things, and rather than treating people as knights or knaves, we would be treating people as human beings that could understand. So we've got a draft of a concluding chapter that we're going to do a second edition of the book, clean up some of the errors that we've discovered, and publish a conclusion to it, in which we say that forgiveness, the principle of charity, and fairness in talking to each other has to be the first objective that we can achieve. And we're not going to get at truth, and we're not going to get at reconciliation if we can't get to speaking to each other in a fair and equitable and face-to-face manner without being disparaging towards each other. So, and we've been yelling at each other, it seems.
Yeah, well, that is sort of answers my next question I was going to ask you, and it seems to me that is the purpose of this. Let's call it an epilogue to the book, this chapter that you've written. I was going to ask you, what advice can you offer to help reconcile Canadians to the truth about IRS? That is the full story. But I think you've just answered that, right? We've got to listen to each other. We've got to talk to each other and really have a full discussion about this without condemnation, right?
Sure.
That's more based upon understanding and acceptance of mistakes that were made in the past, as you say, forgiveness, as opposed to the types of apologies that have been offered by various prime ministers. Really a true forgiveness and a true understanding of what happened in the past, because it's through that we're going to reach a reconciliation. In other words, talking about the real truth. That's how we're going to get to reconciliation. Is that a fair
Yes, it is.
Summary of your position?
Yes. And it seems to us, from the people that we've been interacting, many of them don't want to say anything publicly because they're have position of authority, and they don't want to be condemned for being, sympathetic to something that could be perceived as being as outlandish as Jay Bhattacharya's position on the COVID epidemic. And is polarizing people. And we think, that sucking money out of non-Aboriginals and recent immigrants that come from war-torn positions, places in the world where they've really suffered badly, to pay off something that happened 150 years ago or 100 years ago and wasn't nearly as traumatic as it pretends to be in the literature, in the popular literature, and having resentment on the side of people that are paying for these kinds of things. $40 billion, for example, for the children that were taken from families and adopted by white families. That's a tremendous amount of money that's going to be paid over a number of years, and taxpayers are going to have to pay that. And I think we should be fair, to absolutely everybody. And I think beyond that, if we go back to the beginning of time, we all belong to groups that have been kicked by other groups, and we all belong to groups that have kicked other groups. So maybe we should just trade a loonie and call it fair and start all over again, instead of going back into history and pulling these grievances out of that and say, you owe me because of this. I myself was in a sanatorium from the time I was 2 to I was 5 with tuberculosis meningitis, and it wasn't pleasant, but it saved my life.
Right.
What do you say? When I was very young, and every 8 hours a nurse came to give me a needle, and I remember once when I was a little bit older, 4 or 5, I told them. She said, "Which side do you want it on?" And I said, "I don't want it on either side. I don't want one of these great big needles being stuck into me." But you live through these kinds of things and get on with your life and make the best for our children. And I think we're digging a grievance pit that young Aboriginal people may have a really difficult time getting out of if you keep saying that you got absolutely no control over your life, and your life has been shaped and developed, and the whole of it is related to, first of all, colonialism, and then second of all, to Indian residential schools. That's pretty depressing.
It puts them squarely within sort of the broader victim culture, doesn't it? And it's funny that what you just said reminded me of a couple of things. There's a very famous British comedian, there's been the news recently, John Cleese, made some comments about reparations that needed to be made to the British
Right.
by the Romans.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, he was taking a point, but of course, there's an ounce of truth in that. And then the other thing I thought of was Roald Dahl, the famous author of many beloved children's books like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I remember reading in his memoirs, he was in a somewhat posh boys' school in England during the same time, and many of the things that are complained about at Indian residential schools also were taking place at his school in terms of physical discipline and ostracization and many things that let's say gentler society today would consider quite anathema to the proper way to treat young school children were happening in a very high-priced British school where many future leaders were being prepared for life. But I want to come back to this point and maybe finish off here, Doctor, because we've kept you for a long time. This point about oikophobia. And again, this is Dr. Roger Scruton talking about this in one of his books. And here he talks about fear of the familiar.
Yeah.
The disposition in any conflict to side with them against us. Yeah. And the felt need to denigrate the customs, culture, and institutions that are identifiably ours. And so what we're seeing kind of wrapped up in this whole conversation about Indian residential school is a deeper undercurrent of really hatred, fear, guilt, loathing, almost a self-loathing of many of the things that for generations Canadians were taught to cherish and
Yeah.
to hold as virtues.
Yeah.
And of course, we're seeing this displayed so much in the public discourse, especially by people like our prime minister, who's apologizing for. I've lost track of the number of apologies he's made on behalf of things that have happened in the past. Some of them have to do with let's take the Kamloops situation, where the Canadian flag hung at half mast for months.
Yeah, 5 months.
Right. So my question to you is, what's going on here? Why is this sort of this fear, this phobia, this conflict where we're let's say the left or in the public discourse, there's just sort of this self-hatred, and more than that, the belief that somehow this is going to benefit generations of Indigenous people, both past and present and future. How does this translate? Do you have anything to offer us in that regard, having studied this for so many years?
Just despair. It makes me disparage what's going on. I think we can sink Canada, and if we live in a country that is probably one of the best countries to live in the world, cleanest, fairest. My wife and I have been married for 54 years, and the people were absolutely interested in us being married across ethnic lines, and interested in her and her residential school experience. Nobody was condemnatory about us getting married or having children or raising a family or doing anything. So the kinds of things that people are talking about now in terms of discriminating against people because of their color has been absolutely foreign to our experience over the last 55 years in our country. Even in the so-called redneck southern Alberta, people, both Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people, were absolutely fair to us and sympathetic and understanding of our situation. They weren't condemnatory. They weren't picking on either me because I'm white or her because she's Blackfoot. They just treated us as individuals. So to polarize ourselves into ethnic groups and then to have such fundamental differences that are irreconcilable is a way of tearing down our country and destroying the lives of everybody. I don't think if we eat the goose that lays the golden egg, we're going to have any golden eggs left over. We're going to have a good feast for a little while, and then we're going to be out of luck.
So part of the message of your book really is that message, but also there's an optimistic one, and that is there is a path to reconciliation, but it's through looking at the truth and talking about it, and not censoring ideas that some people are triggered by.
Yes.
And looking at Indigenous people and white people, let's say, not based upon their color of their skin, to quote the late Martin Luther King Jr.,
Absolutely.
but looking at the content of their character,
Absolutely.
who they are as people.
Absolutely.
Well, and Dr. Clifton, sorry, go ahead, sir.
I was going to say, and that's the way the Blackfoot treated me when I went there. They kibitz because they're a verbal kibitzing kind of culture, and the people would poke at me, but we would poke back and force each other to make things that look like racial intended slights of somebody, but it was all in terms of the humor and that kind of fundamental relationships where we recognize our humanity and we recognize that we on both sides there has to be forgiveness, and it's not just one way, it's both ways that has to go, and the discussion has to be both ways. So our basic point is to say this is first established, and then a commission has to meet in which people sit down across from each other, people of goodwill and people of that want to keep the country going, sitting across from each other and negotiating a something that could be called reconciliation, that wouldn't go on from now until the end of time, but actually could be carried out,
Right.
and people would then say, okay, it's over. Let's go on with our lives, and let's go on with the country.
Yeah, it's interesting. This reminds me a little bit of a conversation I had just this morning with a student in my law office. Her name's Sylvia Watt. She came to me and she asked me, she said, I really want to learn more about indigenous culture. And, how do I do that? I said, well, have you thought about maybe going to a powwow?
Yeah.
Have you thought about just go down to the local friendship center?
Yeah.
And I said, you'll be surprised to learn that that these folks, just like you, are very proud of aspects of their culture, their artistic culture, their oral history, their food, their dance, their music. And when they see you take an interest in that, that's not cultural appropriation. That's sharing of a shared cultural truth, which makes up Canada. We're all Canadians.
Yeah.
And my experience with Indigenous peoples is that they want this reconciliation. They want everybody to be under the same tent or the same teepee. They want the kind of reconciliation that you're talking about. And I find that the type of politicking, the type of ideology that your book, let's say, is critical of or closely examines, that's what's driving a wedge between people. That's driving us apart. And we've got to get people more together. And we do that through reconciliation, comes through talking about the truth, right? Yeah. Well, go ahead, Doctor.
I talked at University of St. Boniface, and in the University of St. Boniface, it's a French university. There were students from Africa. There are Métis students from Winnipeg and from Manitoba, and there's French immersion kids. And to see these kids, and they're talking and they're arguing in the lunchroom, and nobody cares about the color of the kids or what gender they are or sexual orientation. They just enjoy each other on the human level. That's the ideal, I think, that we should be aiming for, rather than the polarization of our population into those that owe and those that are owed. Let's try to get over this difficulty and get on with our lives and make the world a better place for all of us.
Well, Dr. Clifton, Rod, I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts and your mind and your vast knowledge of this topic with us today. The goal of this podcast is always to have a deep and meaningful conversation. We assume that the people consuming this podcast are intelligent, and therefore they are hungry to engage in conversations like the one that we've had today. So we're very grateful to you for being a part of that and for facilitating this discussion.
Yeah.
I'm hopeful that people are going to be very fascinated by this topic and what you've talked about. And in order to help them further their understanding of some of these things, this is the point of the show where we conclude and you get to make some reading recommendations. I'm going to make a couple of my own and then give you the final word, if that's okay. First of all, I want to recommend your book because I think it's just brilliant. I think it's just brilliant.
Thank you.
It hasn't received enough attention as a major work of Canadian history, and more than Canadian history, but also I would throw in there anthropology and sociology. So the book is called From Truth Comes Reconciliation. It was published last year. It's available at Amazon. Also, I understand some copies are available through the Frontier Center for Public Policy, which was instrumental in its publication. So they deserve some credit. The other book that I'd recommend, this might seem a little bit strange, is a book called The Strange Death of Europe. It's written by a brilliant British author named Douglas Murray.
Yeah.
And the reason why I recommend it is that The Strange Death of Europe talks about European people in the context of them, of their being the threatened extinction of Europeans being the indigenous people to Europe. And so that book provides a very unique perspective of the people as indigenous to that continent. And it sort of inverts things from the Canadian perspective. But what that book does, I found when I read it, was very fascinating as a Canadian, is that a lot of the same issues arise. A lot of the same fears and phobias arise. A lot of the same emotional responses. A lot of the same ideologies come forth. And also, you were just talking about the censorship of certain perspectives on Indian residential schools in Canada. Well, some of the ideas that Europeans have about the preservation of traditional European cultures, which of course go back hundreds and thousands of years, those perspectives are being censored because they're considered racist or xenophobic, which is very odd because, of course, Europeans are the indigenous peoples of Europe. So I recommend that book for that reason, because it gives kind of a different perspective on some of these same issues. But from there, Dr. Clifton, could you share with us from your vast library of over 50 years of academia, a couple of books that people could...
Yes, sure. Two books, and they're very simple books. One is one by Eric Bays, who was a Anglican bishop, and it's called Indian Residential School, Another Picture, and it's published by a small publishing company called Bayco Publishing, and it was published in 2009. It's a very nice rendition of his experience being the bishop of a bishop in Saskatchewan and having residential schools in some of his parishes. The second one that I would like to recommend is called Guts and Glory: The Arctic Skiers Who Changed the World, by Sally Manning, with a foreword by Becky Scott. And Becky Scott was the Olympian who won the gold medal in cross-country skiing. And this is a book about the first sisters, about all the kids that come through the ski program that Father Mouche organized in Inuvik when he was doing it when I was there. So these kids were out skiing in the middle of wintertime in Inuvik in 1966, and 6 years later, in 1972, the Olympics were in Sapporo, Japan, and 7 of the 8 Canadian skiers on the Canadian Olympic team were from Inuvik and had come through this program that Father Mouche, who was a priest in the Roman Catholic hostel, had organized. And I had been a cross-country skier in Jasper, and so I had my skis shipped up there, and I went skiing with these kids. So this one, Guts and Glory, beautiful book about these kids growing up, and the first girls from Fort McPherson, Jeanette Tourangeau from the Mackenzie River, and some other kids that learned how to ski in Father Mouche's program and become Olympic skiers for Canada. 6 years, within 6 years. An incredible story.
Yeah,
an incredible story.
Well,
so
thank you
those
very
are the
much.
two that I would recommend besides my own book.
Wow, I strongly endorse your book.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing those other readings. I'm certainly going to check out that one about the skiers. I'm looking forward to reading that book. I was not aware of it till just
beautiful.
now. But more than that, thank you for spending some time with us today and sharing your mind and your heart. And also some optimism, which is one of the goals of our podcasts. So thank you very much for being with us.
Yes.
Today, and for sharing with us in what I think was a deep and meaningful discussion.
Thank you. And when it comes out on YouTube, I would like to know about it so that I can send it out to all my contacts and have them, get online to get more of your material that you're doing.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned that because for people who are interested, the episodes of this program are available on YouTube. Also, there is a Facebook presence that we have. It's the Gray Matter podcast. So if you want to find out more about this program, its focus and its purpose, please check out the Facebook page. We have a presence there, and also on Twitter. The more support that we can get for the program, the more we can keep it going. And the goal is, with our podcast, is the same goal that you have, Dr. Clifton, with your book, and that is to share meaningful ideas and the expression of truth in our culture, within the realm of politics, economics, history, sports, philosophy, and religion. We can't cover all of those in one conversation, but I think you'll agree we hit most of them today. You got the sporting portion right there at the end. You stuck the landing. Yeah. So bravo.
Yeah.
But again, thank you very much for being with us, Dr. Clifton. It's been my great pleasure to have the chance to speak with you today.
Thank you. Bye.